Have you ever heard of Q source? Q source is a fascinating and somewhat mysterious concept in biblical studies. It refers to a hypothetical written collection of Jesus' sayings that many scholars believe was used by the authors of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. So, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are collectively known as the Synoptic Gospels, a designation that stems from their shared perspective and significant overlap in content. They recount many of the same stories about Jesus' life, ministry, death, and resurrection, often using remarkably similar wording. This phenomenon of shared material, particularly noticeable when comparing parallel passages, has puzzled biblical scholars for centuries. Why are these three Gospels so alike but so different? Understanding the nature of these similarities is crucial for understanding the origins and development of the Gospel narratives. While the Synoptic Gospels share a considerable amount of material, they also exhibit significant variations. They include unique stories, different perspectives on the same events, and variations in the order of arrangement of Jesus' teachings. These differences raise important questions about the relationship between the Gospels and the sources they used. If one Gospel simply copied from another, why are there so many discrepancies? If they all drew on common sources, how did those sources evolve and diverge? And these are the questions that the Synoptic Problem seeks to address. The Synoptic Problem is not simply a matter of academic curiosity. It has profound implications for our understanding of the Gospels and the historical Jesus. How we explain the similarities and differences between the Synoptic Gospels influences how we reconstruct the life and teachings of Jesus, how we understand the development of early Christian traditions, and how we interpret the theological message of the New Testament. The search for solutions to the Synoptic Problem has led to various hypotheses, including the two-source hypothesis, which incorporates the Q source, and other models that propose different relationships between the Gospels. The challenge of explaining the synoptic similarities is further complicated by the fact that we have no direct access to the sources used by the Gospel writers. We must rely on textual analysis, comparing the Gospels themselves, and looking for patterns and clues that might shed light on their origins. This process of textual criticism is a complex and demanding task, requiring careful attention to detail and a deep understanding of the historical and cultural context of the Gospels. The ongoing debate about the Synoptic Problem highlights the complexities of interpreting ancient texts and the limitations of our knowledge about the origins of Christianity. The Q hypothesis, also known as the two-source hypothesis, is a leading explanation for the similarities and differences among the Synoptic Gospels. It proposes that Matthew and Luke independently use two main sources in composing their Gospels, Mark's Gospel and a lost collection of Jesus' sayings, which scholars have labeled Q. The Q stands for the Germanic word quell, meaning source. This is the source. This hypothetical document Q is believed to have contained primarily sayings and teachings of Jesus without a narrative framework like the Gospels we have today. And if I pronounce quell or Quelle incorrectly, that's on me. The Q hypothesis suggests that Mark's Gospel, which is generally considered to be the earliest of the Synoptic Gospels, provided Matthew and Luke with a basic narrative outline for Jesus' ministry. Both Matthew and Luke then supplemented Mark's account with material from Q, especially the sayings of Jesus that are not found in Mark. This would explain why Matthew and Luke share some of the same sayings of Jesus, even though they often arrange them differently within their Gospels. The Q source in this model represents a distinct stream of tradition about Jesus independent of Mark's Gospel. The concept of Q is not without its challenges and uncertainties, because no actual copy of Q has ever been discovered. Its existence remains hypothetical, and we can only reconstruct its potential content based on the sayings shared by Matthew and Luke. However, the Q hypothesis provides a compelling explanation for the complex patterns of similarities and differences among the Synoptic Gospels, and it has become a widely accepted model among biblical scholars. The Q hypothesis has significant implications for our understanding of the early Christian movement. If Q existed, it would represent one of the earliest written sources for Jesus' teachings, potentially dating back to the first few decades after his death. It would also suggest that there are diverse traditions and collections of Jesus' sayings circulating in early Christian communities, not just the Gospels that were eventually included in the New Testament. The Q source, in this view, offers a valuable window into the formative period of Christianity, a time when the memory of Jesus was still fresh and his teachings were being interpreted and transmitted in various ways. The evidence for the existence of the Q source is primarily based on the analysis of the Synoptic Gospels. The most compelling argument comes from the observations that Matthew and Luke share a significant number of Jesus' sayings that are not found in Mark. These shared sayings, often referred to as double tradition material, suggest a common source beyond Mark's Gospel. If Matthew and Luke had simply copied from Mark, it would be difficult to explain why they both include these additional sayings. Furthermore, the wording of these shared sayings in Matthew and Luke is often remarkably similar, even when the surrounding context is different. This close verbal agreement further strengthens the case for a written source. It's unlikely that the two independent oral traditions would have preserved the sayings in such similar forms. The verbatim or near verbatim agreement suggests that Matthew and Luke were drawing on a common written text. In addition to shared sayings and similar wording, there are also instances where the order of sayings is similar in Matthew and Luke, even though the overall arrangement of their Gospels is different. This suggests that Matthew and Luke were not only using the same source, but also, to some extent, preserving its original structure. While the order is not always identical, the patterns of similarity are suggestive of a written document that influenced both Gospel writers. The cumulative weight of this evidence, the shared sayings, the similar wording, and similar order, makes a strong case for the existence of Q. Even though no physical copy of Q has ever been found, the textual evidence points to a common source that both Matthew and Luke used independently. The Q hypothesis, while still subject to debate, offers a compelling explanation for the complex relationships among the Synoptic Gospels and provides valuable insights into the early transmission of Jesus' teachings. Despite the compelling arguments in its favor, the Q source remains a hypothetical document. There is no actual copy that has ever been discovered, leaving many questions about its nature and content unanswered. This lack of direct evidence is a significant limitation in our understanding of Q and its role in the formation of the Gospels. We can only reconstruct its potential content based on the sayings shared by Matthew and Luke, and there's no guarantee that our reconstructions are entirely accurate. One of the biggest unknowns about Q is its exact content. While the sayings can be identified that are shared by Matthew and Luke but not found in Mark, we don't know if this represents the entirety of Q or if it contained other material that was not preserved in either gospel. It's possible that Q was a much larger collection of Jesus' teachings and that Matthew and Luke selectively incorporated the sayings that were most relevant to their own purposes. Another open question is the nature of Q. Was it a single unified document or a collection of smaller texts? Was it written in Greek, the language of the New Testament Gospels, or in Aramaic? These questions are crucial for understanding the context and transmission of Q, but they remain a matter of speculation. The hypothetical nature of Q also raises questions about its authority and its influence in the early Christian community. How widely was it circulated? Was it considered authoritative by all Christians or only by certain groups? Did it play a significant role in the development of early Christian theology? Again, questions that we may never be able to fully answer. Despite the uncertainties surrounding it, the Q source is a significant concept in biblical studies, offering valuable insights into the origins of the Gospels and the early transmissions of Jesus' teachings. If Q existed, it would represent one of the earliest written sources for Jesus' words, potentially dating back to the first few decades after his death. This would make it a crucial witness to the earliest traditions about Jesus and his message. The Q hypothesis also sheds light on the diversity of early Christianity. The existence of Q suggests that there were various collections of Jesus' sayings circulating in early Christian communities, not just the Gospels that were eventually included in the New Testament. This highlights the fact that early Christianity was not a monolithic movement, but rather a diverse collection of groups with varying interpretations of Jesus and his teachings. The Q source, if it existed, would also have important implications for our understanding of the historical Jesus. By identifying the sayings that were attributed to Jesus in Q, we can get a clearer picture of what Jesus himself might have said and how his teachings were understood in the earliest Christian communities. This can help us to distinguish between the core message of Jesus and the later interpretations and elaborations that developed in the Gospels. The Q hypothesis has significantly influenced the study of the Gospels and the development of early Christian history. It has provided a framework for understanding the complex relationships between the Synoptic Gospels and has opened up new avenues of research into the origins of Christianity. And while the Q source remains a hypothetical document, its existence is strongly supported by the textual evidence, and it continues to be a valuable tool for biblical scholars seeking to understand the earliest traditions about Jesus and his message. While the Q hypothesis is widely accepted among biblical scholars, it is not without its critics. Some scholars argue that the similarities between Matthew and Luke can be explained in other ways without the need to argue a lost source. Some critics of the Q hypothesis suggest that Matthew and Luke might have used oral tradition or other written sources besides Mark. They argue that the similarities in wording could be due to memorization and the fluid nature of oral storytelling, where similar phrases and expressions might naturally arise. They also point to the possibility of other lost written sources, not just one single Q document that might have contributed to the shared material in Matthew and Luke. Also, some scholars question the assumption that Matthew and Luke used Mark's gospel as a primary source. They propose alternative models for the relationships between the Synoptic Gospels, such as the Ferrer hypothesis, which suggests that Mark used Matthew and Luke used both Matthew and Mark. These alternative hypotheses offer different explanations for the synoptic similarities, challenging the need for a hypothetical Q source. The debate about Q highlights the challenge of reconstructing the history of early Christianity and the complex relationships between the New Testament texts. It underscores the limitations of our knowledge about the sources used by the gospel writers and the process by which the gospel narratives were formed. While the Q hypothesis remains a dominant theory, it is important to acknowledge the ongoing debate and the alternative explanations that might have been proposed. The ongoing discussion about Q is not simply an academic exercise. It has significant implications for how we understand the Gospels and the historical Jesus. If Q existed, it would provide valuable insights into the earliest traditions about Jesus and his teachings, potentially offering a glimpse into the core message of Jesus before it was interpreted and elaborated upon in the Gospels. If Q did not exist, then we might need to find other ways to explain the synoptic similarities, which could lead to different conclusions about the development of early Christian thought. Despite uncertainties surrounding it, the Q source remains a compelling and influential concept in biblical scholarship. It serves as a catalyst for discussion and debate, prompting scholars to critically examine the evidence and to explore different possibilities for the origins of the Gospels. Whether or not Q actually existed, the question it raises are essential for understanding the complex history of early Christianity and the transmission of Jesus' teachings. The ongoing quest to understand the Synoptic Problem and the potential role of Q continues to be a central focus of biblical scholarship.